Hi everyone, this is a brief critical analysis of the toxic Desi Aunty culture. If you look at social media, specifically Desi social media, you will note that a good portion of it is dedicated to calling out Desi Aunties. Memes, jokes, and even real social movements have been put into place to stop toxic Desi Aunty culture. Why has a generation decided to attack the older women in their community to the point of making fun of them on such public platforms? The Desi community is quite diverse, spanning several countries, religions, and hundreds of languages and dialects. I will be speaking from the Pakistani Muslim perspective, but overall, it is a standard across the Desi community to respect and honor our elders. That being the case, it is shocking how the youth, specifically young female Desis, have created a large social pressure to dismantle toxic Desi aunties. What has caused this very public rift between generations of women in the Desi community? When you try to figure out why a group does what it does, you have to look at the context and background. You have these Desi aunties who most likely immigrated to places like Canada with their spouses. They faced racism from the inhabitants of their new home, who had trouble accepting their brown faces, colorful traditional clothing, strongly scented cooking, and broken English. These women initially faced isolation, as they were often rejected by white society. They did not have the extended family for support, specifically compassionate maternal figures such as their mothers or aunts. Many stayed home to look after the children while their spouses worked, which led them to be financially dependent on their husbands and gave them very little decision-making power in the home. Many of these women were victims of domestic violence. Domestic violence is not specific to the Desi community. You just have to have the right ingredients in place. An isolated family, struggling financially to support their children and extended family back home on one income, experiencing racism that limits their potential in society, lack of social support, lack of emotional support from a social network. All these things add up, and boom, you have yelling, threats, physical violence, and obscenities. Many of these aunties faced this, and because there was no home to go back to or no social support to leave the violence and not end up destitute, many of these aunties remained in these volatile homes for the sake of their children or because they just had no other option. A unique abuse these women faced was the constant insults they heard about their appearance from their husbands. Their husbands, who viewed the white woman as the ideal, perhaps due to some inferiority complex or colonial brainwashing, would view their wives as unattractive because they were brown, short, and round, while the white woman was tall, thin, blonde, and blue-eyed. And unfortunately, her kids would pick up on these taunts by their father and would feel ashamed to be with her in public with her shalwar kameez. Oddly, the day she decides to wear pants and shirts, her husband would mock her even more. "What are you trying to be, like a gori, white lady?" And hysterical laughter would follow. If these women were especially ill-fated, they would be responsible for the influx of relatives her husband would sponsor. Yes, in addition to her brood of kids, she would now feed and clean up after all the relatives who would live with them in their very tiny home. She would now have to not just obey her husband, but to also obey her mother-in-law, father-in-law, sister-in-law, brother-in-law, their kids, you get it. Her ability to live peacefully in this home would be based on how subservient she was to all these people in the hierarchy. So how do you survive in a home full of violence, in a society that does not accept you, with a husband who does not love you, with children who are embarrassed of you? What do? You become superficially meek around people more powerful than you. You become very careful with every action. You become very hyper vigilant. You become very hyper observant of everything. You become very secretive. You create a grapevine with other Desi women. Your mode of communication becomes gossip and hearsay, because that's the only way oppressed people can communicate. And as the kids grow up, you finally go out and find employment. This will make the husband happy because more money will be coming in. If he's not too controlling, he might let her take a course, maybe a certificate or a diploma, nothing too long, because she has to take care of the house. Just something that will increase the family income. This will be a big step for a woman who was housebound, a servant to all, whose only previous social outing was going to the masjid every Friday or Sunday for prayers or children's classes. And as she heads out, she will be reminded by her spouse to stay within her awqat, which is her true value. After all, she needs him to survive. And don't you forget, I brought you to Canada. The gatherings of these aunties at the masjid became an escape for them. It's where they developed friendships and supports of sorts, even if it was just verbal. There would be whispers of job opportunities. It will help you get out of the house, at least, they will say. They will unburden their grief to one another, and I remember as a child being a part of that, sitting in the middle, like as if you're in a hive and there's bees buzzing. The aunties would laugh and talk. It was fun, as long as they weren't laughing and talking about you or your mom. It would have been a great support system for a disenfranchised group to use their regular meetings at the masjid to build a sisterhood of support and slowly plan the overthrow of the patriarchy, or at least develop the strength to put them in check. But it has been witnessed throughout history that when a group is abused, a group that is lower in the social hierarchy, they eventually repeat the abuse amongst each other, a form of lateral violence. Women who were ridiculed at home for their appearances by their spouse will mock other women who they think are beneath them. Women who were shamed for their accent by their children, spouse, and society will laugh at the latest newcomer and her poor grasp of English or overuse of Urdu, their traditional language. Women who were derided for their cultural clothing will insult the newcomer who wears shalwar kameez and a head covering. People who have been abused, violated, and hurt will perpetuate that hurt until they achieve healing. It took me several years to understand why the aunties in my community were the way they were. I had a deep-seated dislike for some of them, coupled with fear of their jibes and taunts. The toxic Desi Aunty culture was a combination of a hyper-conservative patriarchal society, coupled with poverty, racism, lack of economic freedom, lack of voice, lack of respect, lack of hope, and lack of self-respect. With all that being said, there is still a real reality to the toxic Desi Aunty culture, and I will share some of my experiences from my life with you. I remember at 2 separate weddings, there was a group of women who were smirking and laughing hysterically. From a distance, you would think it was just some old friends having a good time at a party. But in fact, as I got closer, I realized that they were making fun of the bride. As a child, I had not yet developed an understanding of what qualified as beautiful. To me, the bride was dressed in beautiful clothing, with gold jewelry, seated on stage. She was the center of attention for that day. She was beautiful in my mind. But no, to these aunts, she was deemed unattractive, too short, too dark, too many somethings that went against the bride. It was shocking to see, and it was shocking to hear, that even on such a special day, people can deride you. In that moment as a young child, I hoped that the bride seated not too far away would not hear the mean comments these aunties were making. Aunties were obsessed with the young girls who were most white passing. For a Desi girl, that meant fair skin, nice hair, tall and slender. A great bonus would be to have colored eyes. These girls were cherished, hugged, loved, and always received kind words, being told you have such noor on your face, when in fact it was just a lack of melanin. The darker ones were often ignored, as if they were scraps. Being light-skinned in the masjid meant you were given preferential treatment and better roles, while the dark girls stood in the back and did bathroom duty. Oddly, as these girls grew up, the more fairer ones were always viewed as the Virgin Mary, incapable of doing anything wrong, even though they had quite some colorful escapades. While the brown girls, if they dared to wear their hair in a modern do or wore makeup, were immediately deemed sluts. In both these two situations, the aunties were playing out their own insecurities. They were making fun of a bride that shared a lot of their physical traits, because that's what was done to them. They were infatuated with fair-skinned girls because society and their husbands derided them of their own brown skin. Another phenomenon was how the aunties treated victims of domestic violence in the community. It became known that it would be wise not to reveal your marital problems to the community for help. There were several reasons. For one, nobody valued confidentiality. So anything you said would be spread like wildfire with some extra doses of gasoline. If somehow the community deemed the woman to be wrong, which they often did, her shortcomings would be discussed in the next Friday's sermon. A sort of warning to all other potential dissenters to shut up and be grateful, for womankind is a truly ungrateful creature. And thirdly, as soon as news got out that a couple is quarreling, in would come all the non-biological sisters and aunts ready to comfort the poor fellow and offer the hand of their daughter or sisters in marriage. So yeah, it was in the best interest of everyone, if you were in an unhappy or violent marriage, to just remain quiet. So whenever a woman's marital troubles were leaked, I would see the aunties or the women of the community mockingly ask her, "What's wrong? I heard your husband is headed to Pakistan looking for a new wife." They would point fingers and whisper in quite loud voices about her inability to keep her man happy. The reality is, all these aunties were scared. They knew it could happen to them. Their husbands were the same. So instead of associating and helping a slandered woman, they would deride her quite publicly and would go out of their way to show that we do not have anything in common with this abandoned woman. It was an act of self-preservation. Another interesting thing was, and perhaps once again linked to the patriarchy, was how aunties allowed their sons to get away with everything, whether that be staying out late, dating, marrying someone of their choice. They never wanted to be on the bad side of their sons. They pampered them. They let them get away with a lot. Why? Because they knew in order to survive, they needed someone in the patriarchy to support them. They did it with their husbands, and now, in their old age, they needed support, and that would be their sons. These aunties would always speak highly of their sons and their academic success and career aspirations. But as soon as these sons were free from the grips of their Desi parents, they distanced themselves immediately from such needy mothers. Mothers who received no love from their husbands and so survived on the attention and support of their sons. Or, on the other side of the spectrum, there were aunties who had a very strict control over their sons' lives. They decided where they would be married and forced them to keep their wives in a joint family system, where they all lived together, and where she would be able to replicate the traumas she went through as a young bride, because now she finally climbed the patriarchal ladder and could exert her dominance on the new weak person, her daughter-in-law. It is that need for control, to be the center of attention when all your life you were put down and ignored, to be feared because you lived in fear, so now you want that power, to be honored for all those sacrifices made for this son, to not have to cook or clean for another damn person again because you're fed up. You basically cooked and cleaned for an entire village your whole life. You're done. It is all those things, plus seeing a young, beautiful daughter-in-law potentially living a better life than you. Yes, jealousy is real. Regret over the loss of your youth is real. And the weird thing is that our aunties don't think that now it's their time to live their lives. Like their white counterparts, they don't take up yoga, they don't volunteer, they don't write memoirs, they don't have poetry clubs or ladies' night, they don't take up a hobby. And these preoccupations would do the entire community a lot of good. It would do them good, and it would do good for their sons and daughter-in-laws, so they can have the privacy they need to be in a loving relationship. But I guess when you spend your entire life serving other people, and you never actually went out into society and learned that there's other things out there, that it's not just home and work, it's not just serving your husband, his mom, siblings, and your children. When that's all you know, you don't think that, okay, I can do something for myself. You are trapped in that mentality. And now you want your piece of the pie because you struggled for all those years. So it's hard to pick that different path the way other cultures do. Aunties also had the power to make or break a girl's future. How? Well, the marriage system within the Desi community relies primarily on the referral system or word of mouth. This is why, while some aunties who were quite ruthless and mean were still bestowed a lot of respect due to their social scope, they knew a lot of people. This is why these aunties were brought plates of food at gatherings and didn't have to wait in line like the common people. This is why they were invited at weddings even though nobody actually wanted them there. And you were told as a young girl by your mom, go say salam to her. If this auntie disliked you for whatever reason, she made sure that you were unmarried well past your prime. If she was especially vengeful, she would send proposals of 40-year-old men or men from Pakistan who were obviously going to use you as a quick ticket to Canada. These aunties had to be respected, given gifts, and honored. Desi aunties have a preoccupation with getting everybody married, or at least why you're not married. And it can be very insulting in a public situation when when aunties are inquiring about your marital status. It can be very embarrassing. And I think that Generation Xers and millennials and whatever future generations after that, they find it offensive because they view life as having more purpose than just getting married. They want a career, they want to travel, they want to have friends, they want to have a life before they settle down. But for aunties, the only way to live was to get married because it provided them social support of a male in this patriarchal society. It provided them that support, and they cannot comprehend how you will survive without a man because they were not given the opportunities to try, because it was shut down by society or their spouse. Fear was instilled in them that you can't survive without a man, and they perpetuate that by putting that into the next generation. So that's why Desi aunties have a real preoccupation with getting everyone married or just wondering why you are not married. And that is also one of the reasons why the two generations, or the Desi aunties and the generations after them, can't get along. A personal experience of my own was when I decided to wear the hijab at 13 years old. Although at 37 I no longer wear it. My experience was so painful that I thought I should share it. It was the 90s when I decided to wear the hijab. And it really wasn't an acceptable thing to do because at the time, most of my Desi peers were trying to fit in, not stand out. While all the aunties did wear dupattas or head coverings to the masjid, they rarely wore it outside. It was just unheard of for that time. So when I decided to wear the hijab, it was received with a lot of shock by the aunties. Some would mock me behind my back, while others would openly say derogatory things to me or things to put me down, such as, "Oh, here comes grandma." In many instances, I had friends who would come up to me in the masjid and tell me that a certain auntie was making fun of me because of my hijab. It was all very humiliating and made me dread going to the masjid. I received less backlash from the white kids in the predominantly white junior high school that I went to than the aunties in the masjid. I was under such great scrutiny as to why I would leave my head covered in the masjid even after the prayer was finished. They thought I had gone absolutely mad. It took me a long time, but I figured out why these aunties chose to hurt me like that. They came way before me, maybe in the 70s or 60s, when racism was even worse. They had to abandon their identity. They had to cut their long hair. They had to dress in Western clothing. That's what they had to sacrifice in order to fit into a society that hated brown women. And here I was, a small fry, destroying all that hard work by putting my face dead center on my head. You'll see something similar with older immigrants. I once had a lady who was from a European background. She was also an immigrant. She said to me, "You guys have it really easy with all the government aid you receive. When we came to Canada, we got absolutely nothing. We had to work hard to survive." And there is truth to that. I do not deny it. We have more supports now in place than what was before. There's financial aid, educational aid, housing, healthcare, even Head Start programs to ensure that new immigrants successfully integrate. We also have laws that protect immigrants from racism and discrimination. It doesn't mean that discrimination or racism doesn't happen. It just means that now, by law, nobody can do it. But before, for the people who came earlier before us, these laws weren't in place to protect them. So here I was in the 90s expressing my Muslim identity as a child, while these women, the aunties of our community, had given up so much of their identity, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. So obviously, there would be hate. There was also this disbelief that anyone would willingly adopt a head covering, because many of these aunties grew up in Pakistan, where the culture and religion demanded modesty. Many of them were forced to wear a head covering in Pakistan, or even a burqa, which is a full covering of the head and face, whether they wanted to or not, because those were the social norms. So to be in the land of freedom and still wear the hijab when there's no one to force you was beyond their comprehension. And so they labeled me crazy. It took me time to realize why these aunties expressed so much derision towards me. Me having the ability to wear the hijab without repercussions was because of the sacrifices of the brown women before me, who had to give up their identity so white society would give them some space. When aunties see young girls full of hope and potential, I think it's triggering for them, because they recall how they were young, beautiful, and full of hope when they first came to Canada, and how society, their husbands, in-laws, and obligations to their children took a lot of that hope and opportunity away. It is triggering to see the youth have options when you didn't. It's triggering to see happy young brides when you were made to work as a slave. It's triggering to have young people call you out on your politically incorrect views when you did not have the chance to learn about society or social justice because you were working a back-breaking minimum wage job to help pay the bills, sponsor your in-laws, and get away from your violent husband. It can be triggering when young Desi girls give you the side eye about how you've let yourself grow. And they say they're going to make sure that they don't end up like their mom as they head off to their Pilates class or gym. But those moms never actually had the time to go to the gym or to a Pilates class or yoga class because they were too busy fulfilling their obligations to the home. Life can be very triggering when you have been used and abused. And if you've been silenced and your mouth has been clamped by society, by the patriarchy, then you're going to use a very passive-aggressive way to vent those feelings. You're not going to lash out. You're not going to be violent. You're going to use a very passive-aggressive way. And this is what toxic Desi auntie culture is. The passive aggressiveness that these aunties have when they insult the way you look, when they question why you aren't married, when they question why you don't have a child yet, when they question about your career, about how you're doing in university. It's all passive aggressive because they've missed out on something and they have a lot of hurt because of that, and they have to lash out at someone. Those who are abused will carry on that abuse until they receive healing. I know why Generation Xers or millennials have this deep-seated hatred for the toxic Desi auntie culture. Not all Desi aunties are like this, but a great portion of them are, which is why there's all these memes and there's all these platforms condemning them. I would also like to suggest to the Generation Xers and millennials that we're of the age where we are also classified as aunties, and we have experienced our own forms of trauma as first-generation immigrant children or first-generation Canadians. And that's going to reflect in our behaviors, and the youth who view us as aunties will probably make memes out of us too. Many cultures, like the First Nations of Canada, hold their elders to great esteem because of their knowledge and experience. And I find it kind of sad that we don't have that bond with our elders, with the women in our community, the elder women in our community, because we view them with a lot of distrust, a lot of hatred, or we're very, very suspicious of their intentions. And that's not good for a community, and that's not good for a culture. So we need to build a bridge with our elders. We need to understand the trauma that they went through and how that is reflected in their behavior. And they have to acknowledge the hurt that they have done to the younger generations. And together we have to find a way to move forward. We need to ensure that as the next generation of aunties, us Generation Xers and millennials, we do not traumatize the youth with our own traumas. The cycle has to end.